I have the great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Williamson. He's the King Alfonso XIII Professor of Spanish Studies at the University of Oxford. He previously held the Forbes Chair of Hispanic Studies in the University of Edinburgh, an academic post in the University of London and Trinity College in Dublin. He has been a visiting professor at Stanford, Cornell, UCLA, and the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, and has also lectured widely in Latin America, the US, and Europe. His teaching and publication reflect his interest in both Golden Age of Spain and modern Latin America. He's the author of the Halfway House of Fiction, Don Quixote, and Arthurian romance, translated into Spanish with a prologue by Mario Vargas Llosa, and has edited several books. In the field of Latin America studies, he has published The Penguin History of Latin America, which has been translated into Spanish and Portuguese. Borges Alive, translated into 7 languages, and the Cambridge Companion to Jorge Luis Borges. He's currently working on a book on Don Quixote in the context of Cervantes' other writings. Finally, Professor Williamson is a wonderful, wonderful human being. He's very humble and very funny. Also, the title of his talk is Authority and Power in Don Quixote, Part 2. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Williamson.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction and for an even more generous character reference. I'm very pleased indeed to have been invited to this conference, and I want to thank very sincerely Conchita, Domenic, and my old friend Andres Lema Hincapié, the organizers, who've really invested a huge amount of time and energy in making this conference what I consider to be a huge success. It's been wonderful to be here, to meet people, to discuss Cervantes with other specialists, and I think it's a rare treat, to come to a conference, particularly a two-center conference, which has worked so well. I want to thank then the two centers, as it were, the University of Colorado, Denver, and the University of Wyoming for hosting this gathering, and all the sponsors who have made it possible. Now, turning to my talk, you will recall that that in Part 1, Chapter 20, Don Quixote and Sancho are both frightened out of their wits when they hear tremendous noises in the dark of the night. The knight, however, pulls himself together, and as he prepares to charge off in order to discover the cause of the noise, he launches into a heroic speech. Sancho amigo, has de saber que yo nací por querer del cielo en esta edad de hierro para resucitar en ella la de oro o la dorada, como suele llamarse. Yo soy aquel para quien están guardados los peligros, las grandes hazañas, los valerosos hechos, etc., etc., etc. By contrast, Sancho is terrified and tries to persuade his master to await the dawn, but to no avail. So he ties Rocinante's hind legs and declares to his master that the old nag cannot move because it's been enchanted. At daybreak, when they discover that the noise was caused by fulling mills, by batanes, master and servant laugh out loud at the irony of the situation. And Sancho is emboldened to parody the heroic speech the knight had declaimed the night before as he was about to embark on the frightening adventure. So Sancho says, has de saber, oh Sancho amigo, que yo nací por querer del cielo en esta edad de oro, and so on and so forth. Don Quixote, however, reacts to this parody with great fury. He raises his lance and deals Sancho 2 terrible blows on the shoulders. Sosiéguese vuestra merced, que por Dios que me burlo, complained Sancho. Pues porque os burláis, No me burlo yo, retorts Don Quixote. Why is the knight so angry? It is because he perceives in Sancho's mimicry of his heroic speech a threat to his authority, and more broadly, a threat to the hierarchy implicit in the relationship between knight and squire. Sancho, he says, es menester hacer diferencia de amo a mozo, de señor a criado y de caballero a escudero, así que desde hoy en adelante nos hemos de tratar con más respeto. Sancho apologizes. Más bien puede estar seguro que de aquí adelante no despliegue mis labios para hacer donaire de las cosas de vuestra merced, si no fuere para honrarle como a mi amo y señor natural. Cervantes' use of señor natural here indicates that he's sensed the underlying political character of the relationship between the mad knight and his squire at the Fulling Mills episode. The term señor natural was employed in medieval and early modern Spain to describe the relationship between a lord and his vassals. The authority of a señor natural was accepted as legitimate by virtue of the excellence of the lord's personal qualities and because he exercised power in accordance with reason and with the laws of God and man. It was a personal relationship based on reciprocity. The señor natural had to protect and defend his subjects, and the latter, in turn, were under an obligation to offer him their services and to honor, respect, and obey their lord. A señor natural had to rule with the consent and in the interests of his subordinates, but the reciprocal pact could be broken if the señor natural were to behave like a tyrant by using his power to serve his own interests unjustly or by force to the detriment of the common good or the well-being of his vassals. The question of distinguishing between legitimate authority and tyranny had been a fundamental concern of Spanish politics since the Middle Ages. This question was revitalized in the course of the 16th century because of the problems of political sovereignty arising from the conquest of indigenous peoples in the New World and the rise and spread of Protestantism in Europe. But it also acquired a new urgency in the 16th century after the publication in the 1530s of Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince, which began to exercise theologians, political philosophers, and statesmen throughout Christendom. In the last decades of the 16th century, and well into the 17th, at a time when the political and military problems facing the Monarquía Española were multiplying, Spanish political thinkers debated the question of what they called reason of state, razón de Estado, the proposition advocated by Machiavelli in The Prince that a prince or a ruler should not be restricted by ethical considerations in the exercise of power, but should act in a pragmatic manner in order to preserve and increase his dominion. Machiavelli's opponents attacked his pragmatism and condemned reason of state for what they saw as its intrinsic immorality and because, in their view, it sanctioned tyranny. They argued that true reason of state, la verdadera razón de Estado, consisted in the limitation of the power of the prince for reasons of religion, justice, wisdom, prudence, and good counsel. In essence, what Christian thinkers objected to in Machiavelli's thinking was the detachment of power from moral principles. It is in the light of this debate for and against Machiavelli, which was taking place, as you will have realized, precisely during the period that Cervantes was writing Don Quixote, that I will draw the distinction between authority and power for the purposes of this lecture. On the one hand, we have the belief that legitimate authority is founded on the limitation of power by certain ethical or religious principles, and on the other hand, there is tyranny, the exercise of power in an arbitrary, unrestrained, and self-interested manner. What I propose to do this morning is to take up this distinction between authority and power and apply it to the Quixote. I want to consider this binary along two strands. One, a political strand in terms of Don Quixote's relationship with Sancho Panza, but also extended to a literary strand by looking at authority and power in the relations between Cervantes and his reader. My argument will be that the evolution and interplay between these two sets of relations eventually resulted in a general crisis of authority within the Quixote, which contributed in large measure to its modernity as a work of fiction. The political dimension of the relationship between the protagonists arises not just because of the class difference between Alonso Quijano and Sancho Panza, but more specifically because of the kind of bond that is forged between them. Before Alonso Quijano goes mad, the two men are just vecinos in the village of La Mancha. But when Quijano loses his wits and reinvents himself as the knight-errant Don Quixote, he bases his relationship with Sancho on a pact of reciprocal obligations. He promises Sancho an island and some noble title in exchange for Sancho's obedient service as his squire. Once this pact is sealed, Sancho will leave his wife and his home to follow Don Quixote on his adventures. His motives, I believe, are twofold. One, it is sheer material interest. He wants to become the governor of an island and therefore rise in the world. But two, he's powerfully motivated by a sense of social deference towards Don Quixote. And I want to look at this social deference to Don Quixote in more detail. Don Quixote constructs his authority over Sancho by virtue of his knowledge of chivalry, which he has acquired through his reading of books. But from the outset, we can see that the knight's authority is very precarious. When he promises Sancho not just an island to govern, but a kingdom as well, Sancho wonders whether this would mean that his wife would become a queen and his children princes. ¿Quién lo duda?, declares Don Quixote. And Sancho replies, yo lo dudo. Sancho's skepticism, his yo lo dudo, represents a source of power in relation to his master, inasmuch as it could lead him to discredit, reject, or ridicule the version of reality proclaimed by Don Quixote, or worse still, to manipulate the knight's madness for his own profits. Or it could even lead him, conceivably, to abandon Don Quixote altogether, to leave his service. And that, when you think about it, would effectively bring Don Quixote's chivalric mission to restore the world of chivalry in 17th century Spain to an end. So that, I think, is the source of the potential power Sancho has to, through his skepticism, to destroy Don Quixote's chivalric enterprise. So if we look at the relationship in terms of the opposition between Don Quixote's authority and Sancho Panza's power, we shall see a growing conflict between master and servant in the course of their adventures together, a conflict which gives the lie to sentimental, what I regard as sentimental views of their relationship, such as, for example, Salvador de Madariaga's famous theory of the Quixotización, I can never pronounce that one without stumbling, the Quixotización of Sancho and the Sanchificación of Don Quixote, which rests on a notion of what Madariaga called a fraternity of soul uniting master and servant. Sancho gets his first taste of power during the episode I referred to at the outset, the episode of the Batanes, the fulling mills. The squire's parody of Don Quixote's speech mocks the basic source of the authority that Don Quixote holds over him, his knowledge of the books of chivalry, and so it constitutes a potential threat to the foundational pact. And if this mockery of the Señor Natural had been allowed to go unchecked at this point, remember Don Quixote hits him over the head, on the shoulders, Cervantes would have had to face the possibility that Sancho might have challenged the principle of hierarchy, which was the cornerstone of the established order of society. In my view, Cervantes chose to put a brake on the power of Sancho's skepticism by reaffirming the habit of deference that keeps the peasant in awe of his Señor Natural. But although Sancho will never again openly challenge his master's authority for the rest of Part 1, he will begin to use his power covertly. At the fulling mills, Sancho doesn't just mock Don Quixote's heroics, he actually deceives his master for the first time, claiming that Rocinante has been enchanted. He is driven to deception by fear, But notice that the ignorant peasant is beginning to learn something about his master's bookish culture of chivalry, and he's beginning to use that knowledge to manipulate the knight. And the success of his lie at the fulling mills will encourage him to lie again. In chapter 31, Sancho deceives Don Quixote when he returns from El Toboso and pretends that he has met Dulcinea and that the lady has accepted the love of the knight. And notice that this time that boldness shows itself in the way that he elaborates the lie with a certain malice and a certain relish. In part one, then, Cervantes restrains the power of Sancho's skepticism through deference and fear, and as a result, the relationship will remain largely at the level of comic play, at the level of a series of amusing exchanges between an endearing madman and a country bumpkin. But Sancho has begun to act in bad faith towards Don Quixote, and in part two, this propensity to deception and bad faith will have much more serious consequences. Let's turn now to the other strand of the interplay between authority and power, the literary strand. In the prologue to part one, Cervantes addresses the desocupado lector by employing the rhetorical strategy of the traditional modesty topos. ¿Qué podrá engendrar el estéril y mal cultivado ingenio mío, si no es la historia de un hijo seco, avellanado, antojadizo, etc., etc.? He therefore offers his work to the reader for whatever it may be worth, he says, and invites him to judge the work as he pleases. I quote, he's addressing the reader, «Tienes tu alma en tu cuerpo y tu libre albedrío como el más pintado, y estás en tu casa, donde eres señor de ella, como el rey de sus alcabalas». Cervantes inverts the normal hierarchy of literary relations. The reader is king, and the author must submit his work to this sovereign judge. But there is a sting in the tail of this self-effacing modesty, because Cervantes continues this long, winding sentence as follows. Estás en tu casa donde eres señor de ella, como el rey de sus alcabalas, y sabes lo que comúnmente se dice, que debajo de mi manto al rey mato. The author may appear to have abdicated his literary authority in favor of the reader, but he warns the king-like reader that he, Cervantes, the author, still retains the power to surprise and overturn the reader's expectations. Cervantes is clearly playing with the modesty topos, but taking it in a much more radical new direction. The established hierarchy of author and reader has been replaced here by a kind of game, what we might call an ironic game of matar al rey, or killing the king, which transforms the act of storytelling into a self-conscious, ironic performance by an author whose intentions are covert and elusive. And as readers, we enter the game of, let's call it, killing the king straight away. Even in the prologue, when Cervantes said that he would have liked to offer the reader his tale Monde Desnuda without the paraphernalia of sonnets and epigrams and eulogies of the author and the work that are usually found at the beginning of books. But he claims to have found it impossible even to write a prologue, fearing that his insuficiencia y pocas letras would fail to win him the respect of the reading public, given that his tale lacked any erudition or doctrine or citations from ancient philosophers, from Holy Scripture, or from doctors of the church, which other authors tended to use in order to appear hombres leídos, eruditos y elocuentes. He then recounts how a putative friend chided him for this timidity, telling him he could invent his own sonnets and cite whatever Latin phrases and tags he might happen to remember, or better still, just take a dictionary of quotations from other authors and stick them in the preliminaries of his own work. Y cuando no sirva de otra cosa, por lo menos servirá aquel largo catálogo de autores a dar improvisa autoridad al libro. Cervantes is parodying here the whole apparatus of autoritas, the tradition of invoking the support of established authorities, literary, cultural, political, or religious authorities extraneous to the work in question, in order to endorse the author's virtue or erudition or orthodoxy. And this interchange between Cervantes and his friend highlights, I think, an opposition between literary authority and a writer's freedom to exercise the power of his imagination. In fact, the friend tells Cervantes that there's no need to go begging maxims from philosophers, counsels from Holy Scripture, etc. Instead, the friend advises that he should depict what is in his mind to the very best of his ability, setting out his ideas without complicating or obscuring them. The important thing is to express what you want to say freely, without worrying about support of other authorities. But is this friend real, or has Cervantes invented him as part of an ironic game of what I've called killing the king? In other words, cloaking his intentions and teasing the reader. And the game of killing the king continues in the very first sentence of the novel, en un lugar de la Mancha de cuyo nombre no quiero acordarme. The author withholds information from the reader, keeps it under his cloak, and so irony permeates the entire fabric of the narrative. Cervantes' playful approach of the reader is part and parcel, of course, of his parody of the Spanish romances of chivalry, whose authors invariably laid claim to absolute authority as historians and chroniclers. In the hands of Cervantes, such claims are mocked in the wonderfully ludic mediation of the text of Don Quixote to the reader. You know, the whole idea that there's manuscripts by a first autor, and then there is a second autor, and then eventually we get the shifty infidel chronicler Cide Hamete, totally unreliable. We don't know quite whether he's saying the truth or not. And I think all of that is part and parcel of what I'm calling, for the sake of argument, the game of killing the king, this ironic game that Cervantes sets up in the prologue to part one with his reader. Now, in the perspective of this authority-power opposition, I think it's interesting that Cervantes gives this ironic game with the reader a political spin. The reader, after all, is likened to a king who is master of his taxes. By contrast, the author acquires something of a character of a subversive, operating in a cloak and dagger mode, debajo de mi manto al rey mato. In this respect, the relations between reader and author established by Cervantes in the prologue to part one are analogous to the relations between Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. For in the game of killing the king, matar al rey debajo del manto, the reader's authority is as precarious as Don Quixote's in relation to Sancho. We've seen how Don Quixote's authority is covertly undermined by the power of Sancho's skepticism. So too, in the fluid, ironic game that Cervantes sets up between himself and the desocupado lector, the reader's ostensible authority will be undermined by the author's power of invention. Now let's look at how these two strands, the political and the literary, play out in the second part of Don Quixote. In my view, the episode of the so-called enchantment of Dulcinea by Sancho represents the crucial turning point of the entire narrative, of the entire novel, the central crisis, if you like. In part 2, chapter 10, as you all know, Cervantes takes up a narrative thread which he had left hanging in part 1. You'll recall that in part 1, chapter 31, Don Quixote had been assured by Sancho that he had been received by Dulcinea and that Dulcinea had accepted his love. So now, logically, the knight decides to pay his respects to his lady in El Toboso. And this, of course, will force Sancho to deceive his master once again. One lie is followed by another lie. And once more, Sancho will use the same kind of trick as when he first lied to his master at the fulling mills. He will claim that wicked enchanters had been at work to thwart Don Quixote's will. But this time, Sancho is much more cynical. I'll quote, he's thinking to himself, «No será muy difícil hacerle creer que una labradora, la primera que me topare por aquí, es la señora Dulcinea. Y cuando él no lo crea, juraré yo. Y si él jurare, tornaré yo a jurar. Y si porfiare, porfiaré yo más. Y de manera que tengo de tener la mía siempre sobre el hito, venga lo que viniere». Calculating, cynical. And Cervantes also underlines Sancho's sheer malice. «Santo Dios, ¿qué es lo que dices, Sancho amigo?», dijo Don Quijote. «Mira, no me engañes, ni siquiera con falsas alegrías alegrar mis verdaderas tristezas. ¿Qué sacaría yo de engañar a vuesa merced? Respondió Sancho, y más estando tan cerca de descubrir mi verdad. And what is his verdad? But the proposition that this ugly peasant girl is no other than Dulcinea del Toboso. And Sancho is clearly relishing this power to manipulate his master. Note the cruel delight he takes in describing the beauty and finery of Dulcinea and her ladies-in-waiting. Even though he must know by now, he does know by now, how much pain this description would cause the poor knight. I quote, «Pique, señor, y venga, y verá venir a la princesa, nuestra ama, vestida y adornada, en fin, como quien ella es. Sus doncellas y ella, todas son una ascua de oro, todas mazorcas de perlas, todas son diamantes, todas rubíes, todas tela de brocado de más de 10 altos, los cabellos sueltos por las espaldas, que son tantos rayos del sol que andan jugando con el viento. Y sobre todo vienen a caballo sobre 3 cananeas remendadas, que no hay más que ver. By contrast, the knight curses the wicked enchanter who has placed clouds and cataracts in his eyes. And to think, he says, I couldn't see any of that, Sancho. I say it again, and I shall say it 1,000 times. I am the most unfortunate of men. From now on, Don Quixote will succumb to doubts about his destiny as a knight-errant, and therefore will be plunged into a deep melancholy from which he will not emerge for the rest of the novel. The enchantment of Dulcinea brings about a critical shift of power from master to servant. Sancho pretends to have gained the power to see chivalric phenomena instead of everyday appearances, whereas poor old Don Quixote can see only a foul peasant. Indeed, so powerful has this episode made Sancho that he would be capable of breaking Don Quixote altogether if he chose to, either by revealing his lies to his master, or by simply refusing to serve a madman any longer and taking himself off home. Cervantes once again had to find a way of restraining Sancho's rise to power if he was to keep the narrative going. Sancho needs to lie to Don Quixote needs Sancho to lie to him in order to keep his enterprise afloat. But how can Cervantes rein in the power of Sancho? In part 1, it was through fear and social deference. Now it becomes self-interest that restrains Sancho. The peasant still wants to gain the island he was promised by Don Quixote. Sancho's deception transforms the nature of the central relationship. It is no longer a straightforward hierarchy between a señor natural and his servant. Don Quixote and Sancho are now bound by a web of contrary interests which shifts according to circumstances, and so, in my view, anticipates the ambiguous motivation of modern characters. One can go on to discuss this further, but there's no time, obviously, now. For the next 20 chapters, Cervantes will maintain a rough balance between the knight's ostensible authority and the squire's covert power. But by chapter 30, after the disastrous adventure on the river Ebro, Sancho becomes exasperated by his master's chivalric antics and decides to abandon him at the next opportunity and go back home. In other words, to destroy the whole thing. Bien se le alcanzaba que las acciones de su amo, todas o las más, eran disparates, y buscaba ocasión de que, sin entrar en cuentas ni en despedimientos con su señor, un día se desgarrase y se fuese a su casa. Once again, we can observe a strain of cruelty in Sancho Panza's attitude towards his master. Notice that, sin entrar en cuentas ni en despedimientos con su señor. He wouldn't even say anything about his dissatisfaction. He'd just quietly leave him and abandon him and take himself off home. And this, I think, points to, perhaps controversially, what I think is a moral degeneration which his manipulative deception at El Toboso and before has gradually started to operate within his character. However, in the following chapter, Cervantes introduced 2 new characters, the Duke and Duchess, and this is what allows the novel to enter into a new phase and therefore to continue forwards. The Duke and Duchess decide, as we all know, to amuse themselves by playing various tricks on the unsuspecting duo, whose overall effect would be to promote the servant Sancho Panza at the expense of his master Don Quixote, thereby producing a world upside down, as several scholars have pointed out. I've written on this, and I could go on for a very long time about all the episodes in the Duke's Palace, but there's no time for that. I just wanted to make 2 points in relation to the argument I'm developing. Many modern Cervantistas have seen in this world upside down at the Duke's Palace a utopian critique of established authority. And certainly the fact that Sancho shows surprisingly good judgment and common sense in his governorship of Barataria does indeed suggest an instructive contrast between his rule in the interest of the common good and the Duke's self-interested, tyrannical abuse of his power and status. Nevertheless, I would say that Cervantes' perspective, at least at this stage in the narrative, is orthodox and conservative in terms of the ideology of the age. He implicitly calls into question the Duke's exercise of power, but he doesn't question the basis of the system itself. Sancho, after his governorship, willingly returns to the lowly station that heaven has ordained for him in the social hierarchy, having allegedly perceived the vanity of power and ambition. He says, "Yo no nací para ser gobernador, ni para defender ínsulas ni ciudades. Bien se está cada uno usando el oficio para que fue nacido." Cervantes then proceeds to rectify the world upside down at the Duke's Palace and takes steps to rebuild Don Quixote's authority over Sancho. Thus, on the road back from Barataria, Sancho falls into an underground cave, La Cima, and calls out for someone to rescue him, and the person who happens to rescue him is none other than Don Quixote. And Sancho interprets this as a providential sign of the knight's superiority. And so he resolves to enter Don Quixote's service once again. Me paso al servicio de mi señor Don Quijote, que en fin en él, aunque como el pan con sobresalto, hártome a lo menos. And when they later encounter the statues of the 4 Christian knights, Sancho marvels at his master's wisdom. Quedó Sancho de nuevo como si jamás hubiera conocido a su señor, admirado de lo que sabía. And so the hierarchy between knight and squire, between señor natural and criado, is restored after Barataria. Still, even though Cervantes' critique of the Duke may be politically conservative, the episodes at the Duke's Palace are deeply subversive in literary terms. For it is here that Cervantes' stated aim to derribar la máquina de estos caballerescos libros is fully realized. The world upside down, created by the Duke, inverts the traditional climax of chivalric romance. The squire is rewarded, while the knight receives nothing at all. This humiliating injustice at precisely the point which, according to the convention of the chivalric genre, should have marked the culmination of the knight-errant's career, casts doubt on the existence of providence as the guiding principle of the narrative's action, and effectively entails the destruction of the machina, the narrative system of the books of chivalry, such as it functions since its origins in the romances of Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century. Now, at this juncture, Cervantes could well have decided to bring the novel to a close. It was an ideal opportunity, after all. What else was there left to do in terms of the parody of the romances of chivalry? The story of Don Quixote has been told in all its essentials. And so I think one could envisage how the novel could have been brought to an end at this point. After Don Quixote and Sancho leave the Duke's Palace, Don Quixote could have been trampled by bulls in chapter 58. Cervantes could have placed the defeats of Don Quixote, or Don Quixote's defeat at the hands of the Caballero de la Blanca Luna, which is now in chapter 64. He could have brought that forward. And then Don Quixote promises to return to his village, and once back home, the unhappy knight would have recovered his sanity shortly before dying. And this denouement would have resulted in a second part of 62 or 63 chapters, which is longer than part 1, because part 1 has 52 chapters. And if Cervantes had brought the novel to an end at that point, the Quixote would have lost, I would argue, none of its coherence as a parody of the books of chivalry. It would still have derribado la máquina de estos caballerescos libros, as I tried to point out a moment ago. But as we know, things didn't turn out that way. At this point in the narrative, we encounter a curious phenomenon, the appearance of another author, a man who publishes a sequel to Don Quixote Part 1 using this pseudonym Avellaneda. In other words, towards the middle of 1614, when Cervantes had not yet finished writing Part 2, his literary authority was assailed by a rival author. Cervantes' anger at being usurped by a rival is unmistakable. Clearly, he wanted to safeguard his rights as the inventor of Don Quixote, but he was operating in a marketplace where intellectual property wasn't protected fully by law. So without copyright, how could he legitimize his claim to Don Quixote? He had to find other means to stake his claim as the inventor of the Knight of La Mancha. And so another kind of power contest erupts within the text of the Quixote itself. In the last 14 chapters, from chapter 59 to chapter 73, Cervantes engaged in a bitter struggle against Avellaneda to assert his rights to his most successful creation. Let's look at the strategies he used to discredit Avellaneda. One, for the rest of Part 2, he would make insulting references to his rival. And I'm not going to go into all the different references because there's no time. They're well known. Two, he invented a couple of ingenious metafictional devices to discredit Avellaneda within the fictional world. So in chapter 59, we know Don Quixote and Sancho meet two characters, two gentlemen talking about a sequel to the Quixote in which the knight renounces his love for Dulcinea and the true Don Quixote declares that to be an impossibility and so on. And later, in chapter 72, Don Quixote will come across a character in Avellaneda's version called Don Álvaro Tarfe, who will acknowledge that Cervantes' Don Quixote is the authentic Knight of La Mancha, and he even signs a legal document to that effect. Three, and this is, in my view, the most important device that Cervantes invents in order to attack Avellaneda, he changes the course of the narrative itself, and I would argue he prolongs the narrative. He makes Don Quixote decide to prove his autonomy from Avellaneda's version by changing his plan to visit Zaragoza, where the false Don Quixote had gone in Avellaneda's version, and visit Barcelona instead. The decision to change the course of the narrative created several problems. A major difficulty lay in Sancho's motivation. After the good sense and wisdom he displayed at Barataria, how long could Sancho be expected to tolerate Don Quixote's absurd antics? What incentive was there now for Sancho Panza to pretend to be the servant of a man he knows is a madman? Worse still, and this is really bad, back in chapter 35, one of the Duke's hoaxes involved a character disguised as Merlin who announced that Dulcinea would be disenchanted only if Sancho whipped himself 3,300 times on his backside. By changing the course of the narrative and extending it, then Cervantes had no option but to unleash a dynamic that was bound to reproduce the world upside down, which he had put right after the pair had left the Duke's palace in chapter 58, I think it is. An inversion, moreover, which he could not now be corrected because Merlin had given Sancho, and only Sancho, the power to liberate Dulcinea from the evil spell. The inevitable clash between the master who wants Dulcinea to be disenchanted as soon as possible and the servant who doesn't want to whip himself takes place in chapter 60. When Don Quixote becomes so frustrated with Sancho's reluctance to apply Merlin's remedy that he tries to whip the squire himself. Sancho reacts with great fury, wrestles Don Quixote to the ground, places his knee on his master's chest to hold him down. The knight is horrified by this effrontery. ¿Cómo, traidor? ¿Contra tu amo y señor natural te desmandas? ¿Con quien te da su pan te atreves? But Sancho remains defiant. Ni quito rey ni pongo rey, sino ayúdame a mí que soy mi señor. Sancho takes his insubordination further, presenting his master with an ultimatum. Vuestra merced me prometa que se estará quedo y no tratará de azotarme por ahora, que yo le dejaré libre y desembarazado. Donde no, aquí morirás, traidor. enemigo de Doña Sancha. This extraordinary episode, surprisingly, has elicited very little critical attention from Cervantistas. In the Rico edition of 2005 of Don Quixote, Martín de Riquer, who was charged with writing about chapter 60, doesn't mention this fight at all. He goes straight to Roque Guinart, who appears in that same chapter. I looked at the bibliography for that chapter in Rico's edition, and there were only 2 short articles mentioning this fight, and neither of them alluded to the political implications of it. Subsequently, Carol B. Johnson, in his Cervantes in the Material World, does mention it, but only in passing, and he does mention some aspects of the political implications. So does Peter Dunn, but neither of these 2, neither Johnson or Dunn, really develop that, nor do they see much wider significance in this fight. But I think that, in fact, there is no interpretation of the Quixote that takes this shocking fight into account. And why? Well, I think it's because the fight violates the deeply entrenched notion of a growing fraternal bond between Quixote and Sancho. And yet I believe it is one of the crucial scenes in the Quixote and deserves much closer attention. Note Don Quixote's outraged cry, "Como traidor, contra tu amo y señor natural te desmandas," which echoes Sancho's words at the Fulling Mills episode when he meekly promised to honor Don Quixote como a mi amo y señor natural. Now things are very different indeed. Don Quixote's authority has collapsed because Sancho asserts his own will against his master, declaring, "Soy mi señor." And then Sancho quotes a popular ballad, "Aquí morirás traidor." He calls his master a traidor. Now we can understand why Don Quixote might call Sancho a traitor for fighting him to the ground, but in what sense could Don Quixote have been a traitor to Sancho? The reason for this is surely that by threatening the servant with physical harm for no other reason than to pursue his own personal interest in disenchanting Dulcinea, Don Quixote has betrayed the foundational pact and abused his authority. He has thus behaved, if you like a tyrant towards Sancho, according to the political principles of the time, rather than as a proper señor natural, and therefore Sancho withdraws his consent to be governed by Don Quixote. What's left after the collapse of Don Quixote's authority? Nothing less than the full exposure at last of Sancho's covert power over his master. But it is much more than that. Don Quixote amazingly yields to Sancho's power and vows never to lay hands on Sancho again. Prometióselo Don Quixote y juró por vida de sus pensamientos, i.e. by Dulcinea, juró por vida de sus pensamientos no tocarle en el pelo de la ropa. The fight in chapter 60 represents the climax of the squire's rise to power in part 2. Here the peasant achieves complete dominance over his mad master, who must thenceforth accept his impotence to determine his own destiny. And what will Sancho do with his power? Well, the reader doesn't find out until several chapters later, because during the couple's visit to Barcelona, as Martín de Riquer pointed out, Don Quixote se eclipsa, se apaga y se transforma en un mero espectador. Son páginas en que Don Quixote está totalmente ausente. After they leave Barcelona, however, Cervantes takes up the Don Quixote-Sancho Panza dialectic once again, and he doesn't flinch from drawing out the awful consequences of Sancho's victory over his master in chapter 60. In chapter 68, we find the knight pleading with the squire to whip himself in order to hasten the disenchantment. Sancho refuses, and Don Quixote moans out loud, "Oh alma endurecida, oh escudero sin piedad, oh pan mal empleado y mercedes mal consideradas las que te he hecho y pienso de hacer." In chapter 69, Cervantes will drive Don Quixote to further abasement. The Duke and Duchess pretend that Sancho has the power to bring the maiden Altisidora back from the dead if he allows himself to be pinched by the dueñas of the castle. And when Sancho appears to succeed in resurrecting Altisidora, Don Quixote falls to his knees and begs Sancho yet again to press on with the disenchantment of Dulcinea. Kneeling before his squire in full sight of the entire ducal court, what humiliation! But Sancho remains unmoved. Then in chapter 71, Don Quixote offers to pay Sancho to whip himself. And the squire now is all too willing to negotiate a good price. Don Quixote is abject in his gratitude. Oh Sancho bendito, oh Sancho amable, y cuán obligados hemos de quedar Dulcinea y yo a servirte todos los días que el cielo nos diere la vida. The knight's humiliation, I would argue, is complete. He offers his services, and even those of Dulcinea herself, to the greedy peasant. And yet, even now, Sancho is utterly cynical. He jokes, entraré en mi casa rico y contento, aunque bien azotado. And then he goes off into a wood and starts whipping trees instead. By this stage, the relationship has become a grotesque inversion of the pact on which their relationship has been founded in part one. Sancho's indifference to the knight's suffering suggests that he has been morally vitiated by the web of deceit that he spun round his master in the course of his adventures together. It's true that there are some instances where Sancho declares his affection or admiration for Don Quixote, but such passages have to be read in the context of the general evolution of their relationship, on the whole arc of their relationship, from beginning to end. And it is clear that Pache Madariaga and others, that relationship does not describe, the course of the relationship does not describe the increasing friendship between the protagonists. On the contrary, the conflict of interest between master and servant results in a kind of triumph for the servant. That's certainly how Sancho understands it. He celebrates his return to the village as a triumphant homecoming, declaring happily to his wife Teresa, "Dineros traigo, que es lo que importa, ganados por mi industria sin daño de nadie." And Teresa's reply is an echo of her husband's greed. "Traed vos dineros, mi buen marido, y sean ganados por aquí o por allá, que como quiera que los hayáis ganado, no habréis hecho usanza nueva en el mundo." Sancho has all the power at the end of the novel, and far from exercising it with compassion for Don Quixote, he knows how much Don Quixote is suffering because of the enchantment of Dulcinea. Sancho consciously exploits the stricken knight for his own profit. In contemporary political terms, then, he uses his undisguised power like a tyrant. In short, Cervantes' decision to respond to Avellaneda's plagiarism by changing the course of his narrative. I've not read the right section here. I believe the harshness and cruelty, of the comic vision we find in the last chapters of the Quixote was influenced by Cervantes' anger and frustration with Avellaneda. In this respect, I think it is significant that Cervantes chose to place the two power contests side by side. In chapter 59, he refers openly to his rival Avellaneda and makes Don Quixote decide to go to Barcelona instead of Saragossa. And in the chapter immediately following, chapter 60, he placed the fight between Sancho and Don Quixote. This juxtaposition, I believe, indicates Cervantes' awareness of a certain parallel between Sancho's assault on his master's political authority and Avellaneda's challenge to his authorship of Don Quixote. What we find in this late phase of the Quixote then is what we might call a general crisis of authority. In the prologue to part one, as we've seen, Cervantes had mocked the idea of literary authority and granted, or appeared to grant, the reader the freedom to judge the work for himself. But Avellaneda's plagiarism unnerved Cervantes. And in the last phase of part two, we see the carefree, playful author turning into a jealous proprietor, furiously trying to prevent a usurper from stealing his ideas. The change in Cervantes' authorial role is evident in his use of Cide Hamete Benengeli. The lying Moor, who had started out as a breezy parody of the chronicler magician of the chivalric romances, is latterly converted into a mouthpiece for a defensive Cervantes, desperate to win the reader's approval for his own Don Quixote against Avellaneda's version. So much so that at the very end of the novel, Cervantes gets Cide Hamete to address his pen. Para mí sola nació Don Quijote, y yo para él. Él supo obrar y yo escribir. Solos los dos somos par en uno, a despecho y a pesar del escritor fingido y tordesillesco. You can hardly say that without spitting. Escritor fingido y tordesillesco que se atrevió o se ha de atrever a escribir con pluma de avestruz grosera y mal delineada las hazañas de mi valeroso caballero, porque no es carga de sus hombros ni asunto de su resfriado ingenio. So, despite the various devices he had employed to attack Avellaneda, we find Cervantes at the end still trying to turn the reader against his rival. Indeed, one could say that the legal document that Don Quixote gets Don Álvaro Tarfe to sign in chapter 72, just before the pair are going to go back to their home village, that legal document inscribes in the text of the Quixote itself Cervantes' desire to have his claim to the Mad Knight of La Mancha legitimized by some judicial authority. But this dream of copyright, so to speak, was to no avail. There was no escaping the fluid, treacherous conditions of authorial freedom that Avellaneda had obliged Cervantes to experience. Cervantes' anger and also his anxiety are vividly revealed in the bilious tone of the prologue to part 2, which is a far cry from the tone of part 1, of the prologue to part 1, and is a long diatribe against Avellaneda, in which Cervantes employs the strategy of asking the reader to convey to Avellaneda a couple of insulting stories about madmen and dogs, one verging on the scatological, the other mocking the lumpen imagination of his rival. It's an ingenious rhetorical strategy in its way, but rather indecorous, I would say, insofar as it seeks to involve the reader himself in little more than an unseemly squabble between two feuding authors. The prologue to part 2 also betrays a certain disorientation or inconsistency on the part of Cervantes regarding the question of literary authority. He invokes his patrons, the Count of Lemos and the Archbishop of Toledo, a mighty nobleman and a pillar of the church, respectively, in order to persuade the reader to prefer his version of Don Quixote's story to that of his rival. Estos dos príncipes, sin que los solicite adulación mía ni otro género de aplauso, por sola su bondad han tomado a su cargo el hacerme merced y favorecerme. And then he tries another tactic. If these great men have favored him, Cervantes says, it's because they have esteemed his honra, his nobleza, and his virtud. He thus draws attention to his moral qualities as a further means of enhancing his authority as the creator of Don Quixote. But finally, he calls upon the evidence of the success of part 1, which had already received such wide acclaim. Esta segunda parte de Don Quijote que te ofrezco es cortada del mismo artífice y del mismo paño que la primera. When all was said and done, the most effective authority he could invoke was the self-made authority of his own imagination, an authority earned by the power of invention alone and not by any other form of endorsement external to the work itself. So, in retrospect, we can appreciate that Cervantes owed a substantial debt to Avellaneda. Not only did his hated rival make him experience the true consequences of abdicating his authority as an author, but more important still, Avellaneda drove Cervantes to revise the structure of part 2, and it was this revision that prolonged the mad dialectic between Don Quixote and Sancho Panza beyond what was necessary for the parody of the books of chivalry. By changing the course of the narrative, Cervantes converted the Don Quixote-Sancho Panza relationship into a prism through which the reader could perceive the crumbling of a traditional order of things and the advent of a society in which the legitimate authority of the God-given hierarchy and the mutual bonds of honor and deference that sustained it would give way to individual self-interest, yo soy mi señor, and arbitrary power. Thanks to Avellaneda, Cervantes impelled the Quixote beyond the horizons of early modern Spain, allowing the reader to glimpse in the triumph of Sancho Panza over his grieving master the approach of a new modern Machiavellian world. It was Avellaneda, I believe, who made it possible for Cervantes' Don Quixote to become the first truly modern novel. Thank you.
So we have some minutes for questions.
I have two questions here. That is, besides the issue of Machiavelli, we know that the influence of Machiavelli, the last trail of is way on the portrayal of Chris as a Christian Chris, Christian virtue. And do you take into account, my first question, do you take into account during your application of power relationships and what you're looking at subject, do you take into account the exemplarity of Don Quixote eventually for Sancho Panza becomes an example of Christian virtues for subjects, especially in the second book. My second question is, do you take into account their final desire or all the references in the novel to the pastoral novel relationship in which the pastoral novel makes all shepherds equal except their beloveds who are the sin pastores of the story? Those are my two questions.
Yes, well, I've outlined the relationship and the power relationship. I was interested in trying to trace that arc of the development of that relationship. It's a complex issue, but I do think that the power struggle, if you like, the power contest between Don Quixote and Sancho Panza has been overlooked in traditional Cervantismo. I also think that what has also been overlooked is the fact that Sancho can manipulate Don Quixote, does lie to Don Quixote, is cruel and is cynical, and comes out on top when Don Quixote, in fact, perceives himself to have failed in his enterprise. Now, with regard to the pastoral, there are other genres that are called upon and drawn upon by Cervantes in the whole sweep of this very long novel, and there is that utopian dimension in the pastoral, which I think is important, but that's another area of Don Quixote that one would have to explore. I do think that the fundamental, even though there are many other genres that are at play in Don Quixote, I do think that the fundamental structure is still that of the máquina de los libros caballerescos. I still think that even in part two, Cervantes does not really let go of the idea of parodying the romances of chivalry. The nature of the narrative changes, and I'm certainly fully of the view that there is a distinct qualitative change between parts 1 and 2, but I don't think that change entails the forgetting or the laying aside of chivalric ideas or the patterns of the generic patterns of the books of chivalry. So this is why I would argue that at the Duke's Palace is the place where, according to the conventional terms of the chivalric romance, the knight would have been received with great honor and glory by a powerful lord who would then have the authority to convey on him the traditional reward, which was a noble title and lands. And that, of course, is why Don Quixote, when he comes into the Duke's Palace and is treated like a knight, I can't remember, I'm very bad for quotations, but you will recall that that was the first day that he considered himself to be a true knight in no uno fantastico, because he's expecting that the generic patterns are going to be fulfilled at the great lord's castle. And of course, it's precisely there that he's robbed of the reward that should have been his. And that's when the machina has been completely overturned and destroyed. So, yes, I mean, I think that there are all kinds of different influences, but I would still retain the notion that Cervantes has his primary aim, primary stated aim of derribar los libros caballerescos well before his mind, even in writing part 2. Okay?
Yes, Edwin, this is almost a path-breaking reading of Sancho, anyway, for me, because you mentioned his sheer malice, deception, cruelty, and insubordination, and we like the last element. But what are you going to do with all the people? Even here, I heard so many wonderful, endearing readings of Sancho. So it's not only in the past, right now too.
No, that's right. All I can say is that it's a relationship which fluctuates. It's a complex relationship. And this is why I say in part 2, in part 1 it's not as complex because Sancho accepts his position and defers to his master, Don Quixote. So it's a more straightforward traditional relationship. But I think with the enchantment of Dulcinea, that changes fundamentally. And instead what you have is this increasingly complex tira y afloja between the two. And the sense of that relationship, in my argument, would be that it moves towards Sancho finally having the power over his master, and his master having no option because of Merlin's prophecy but to accept that power. He's become totally impotent. He can no longer. That's a complete denial of what the chivalric knight-errant, the chivalric hero was all about, because the hero is one who takes his destiny, who forges his destiny through his valor and his courage and his nobility. Don Quixote has to concede that he has no power anymore. And I think that one has to build that element, that dimension of the relationship, into an interpretation of the Quixote. I don't think it suffices simply to see it in Madariaga's terms as a growing fraternal bond which unites them in spirit. I really do think that that is ripe for revision. I do agree that there are times in the course of Part 2 when Sancho expresses his affection for Don Quixote, his loyalty to Don Quixote, his admiration of Don Quixote, but I think you have to look at those instances in context. I'll give you one example. I don't know whether we've got time, but I mean, my old teacher, E.C. Riley, wrote a well-known essay on the last omens that Don Quixote fears as he is about to enter the home village, the grillos and the liebre, and he says that Sancho tries to be compassionate to Don Quixote and help him, which he does, but he does it from a position of superiority, from a position of power. It's almost condescending, because he is the one who buys the grillos. He is the one who tells Don Quixote, look, I've broken the spells of these so-called omens. It's helping him, but from a position of power.
Yes, it's a revolution.
Yeah. So I think you'd have to look at these expressions of affection, loyalty, etc., in Part 2, in context, and then look at the sense in which the whole arc of that relationship moves across from beginning to end.
Mira, la idea de que Don Quijote sería el señor natural de Sancho, yo siento que Don Quijote ha creado ciertas condiciones para que Sancho no sienta esos niveles de jerarquía tan fuertes en la relación. Uno de ellos, digamos, para que su autoridad se deteriore, uno de ellos es no cambiarle el nombre, que para mí es fundamental, que hubiera podido hacerlo, llamarlo de otra manera. Sancho quizá es el primero que le da un nombre a Don Quijote, que es el caballero de la triste figura. Después tú tienes, a mí me gustaría explorar si aumentan las recurrencias a lo largo del documento en que Don Quijote llama a Sancho hermano y amigo. Podría uno ver que las recurrencias van aumentando a medida que la narración se desarrolla, y uno podría imaginar que en su relación anterior en el pueblo, porque este es un hidalgo, y parece que su nivel era hidalgo escuderí, estaba más cercano de Sancho en la jerarquía medieval de lo que nosotros podemos imaginar como señor natural. Y el otro que le gustaría que eso, entonces, yo siento que Don Quijote le ha dejado espacios suficientes como para que la relación no sea tan fuertemente jerárquica y que se acerquen más. Y él, claro, tiene esos momentos terribles de escepticismo y de crueldad, como tú dices, pero no siento que sea... una pregunta que me haría yo es, ¿Cómo llamaban los caballeros en las novelas novelas de caballería a sus amos? Yo no sé si los llamarían hermano y amigo.
Bueno, es que no. En esa instancia tendríamos que ver el contexto en que le llama hermano y amigo Don Quijote a Sancho. Es una, sobre todo en la segunda parte, es una relación fluctuante. Hay vaivenes. Pero como he dicho anteriormente, yo creo que el sentido de la evolución no es, como decía Madariaga, muchos otros, hacia una especie de fraternidad, una unión entre el maestro. Madariaga no puede explicar la pelea del capítulo 60. De hecho, él dice en la versión inglesa de su famoso ensayo, "This is a page that all readers of Cervantes would prefer that he would not have written." Lo dice claramente. Es una página que los lectores de Cervantes hubieran querido que no se escribiera. Pero entonces lo que estoy diciendo es que habría que tomar eso en cuenta, porque no es un episodio aislado, tiene sus consecuencias, que Don Quijote mismo está plenamente consciente de que hay consecuencias importantes como resultado de esa pelea. Y el cervantismo no se ha ocupado de esa pelea, lo pasa por alto. De hecho, cuando tú miras a muchas interpretaciones de Don Quijote en estos libros, como por ejemplo la de E.C. Riley o la de Madariaga, la de Gilman, de hecho parece que para ellos el Quijote realmente culmina en los episodios del Palacio de los Duques. No se fijan consistentemente en el progreso de esa relación entre los capítulos 59 y 74. Y yo creo que esos capítulos son muy importantes porque, como he dicho, están influidos por la gran indignación y el sentido de pánico que le entra a Cervantes cuando aparece Avellaneda.
Tenemos una última pregunta.
Sí. Bueno, felicidades, me ha gustado muchísimo. Y simplemente estoy un poco en línea contigo, porque aunque entiendo muy bien lo que dices de la jerarquía y del poder, yo pienso, y sin hablar de la tontería de la sanchificación y quijotización, yo pienso que también el Quijote es una historia de una amistad que surge como algo revolucionario porque hay una relación de desigualdad establecida así. Y entonces ambos personajes sienten ese conflicto y hay tiras y aflojas y hay momentos de violencia, pero yo nunca he leído la escena de la pelea como algo triste, sino como una especie de ruptura de la idea del señorío. Y yo veo a un Don Quijote relajado que dice, ok, porque de alguna forma se inaugura, se rompe para siempre esa idea del señorío y de todo, y es el ser amigos. De alguna manera es como una inauguración de otro tipo de relación que está en la gente, yo lo veo así. No sé.
Bien, no quiero decir que no haya capas de amabilidad y de amistad entre los dos.
Pero hay un afecto.
Hasta afecto de cierta manera. Pero yo creo que esa jerarquía se mantiene y Don Quijote quisiera mantenerla. Y de vez en cuando le pide, se dirige a Sancho como si todavía tuviera alguna validez esa jerarquía. ¿Cómo explicas entonces las mentiras que le cuenta Sancho a Don Quijote? La mala fe. ¿Cómo explicas el hecho de que Don Quijote, después de esa pelea, se queja de Sancho, de su falta de piedad, su falta de lealtad? Se arrodilla delante de Sancho ante toda la corte de los duques y le pide desesperadamente que prosiga con... Cervantes está siguiendo las consecuencias de esta pelea. No es una pelea incidental, como diríamos en inglés. Es una pelea con consecuencias que surge de todo un una evolución orgánica de esa relación y después tiene sus consecuencias y acaba con un Don Quijote roto. Malum signum, Dulcinea no parece.
Bueno, creo que vamos a continuar la charla en el autobús. Mil gracias.